I got pregnant with my ex and thought he had abandoned me. For years later, I find out it's actually his brother's fault. I have no idea how to even explain my situation, but I'll give it a try. I'm aware how weird/unique this is. I mean, if it weren't happening to me, I wouldn't believe it. This is long, but the backstory is needed. I apologize for grammar mistakes as I'm still a little frantic. I've known my ex-boyfriend since we're teens. I'll call him David. We met when I was 15 and he was 18. We lived next to each other in a nice neighborhood. We also lived closer to a small meadow, and just a little farther from that meadow, hidden among so many trees, there was this small river. I'm not doing this place justice because English is not my native language and I'm sure I'm not describing it as well as I could, but it was an amazing place which I used as a little hiding spot whenever I wanted to get away from my parents or people in general. I used to think no one really knew about that place, and if they did, they didn't really bother coming there because through all the time I was there, I never actually saw someone else there besides me. Imagine my surprise when I go there one day and find David sitting by the river. At that time, we'd seen each other around the neighborhood, but that's it. Anyway, that day we started talking and became very close. Not intimate because I was 15 and hated the idea of dating, and he was 18 and wasn't known for long-term relationships. So we get pretty close and I meet his family. His mother was the sweetest thing. His dad I remember was gross, stupid jokes, sexist, ignorant, to which he, David, told me not to mind him. I didn't mind. And then there was his brother, who we'll call Patrick. This is turning out to be long, so I'll be short here. Patrick was just as bad as his father, except no one could deny he really did love and care for David. I don't know how to explain it any better. Patrick was gross. He thought girls were meant only for sex. He was a fucking racist/homophobe with no fear of letting it be known, but when it came to David, Patrick was always there for him. He was overprotective of him, and I remember that made me feel a mixture of sadness/anger, because if he could love his brother so much, then why the hell couldn't he be a better person? Anya, my friendship with David only grew, and I should make it very clear that if Patrick was like his gross father, then David was like his mother, no doubt. David was sweet, caring, his worldview was similar to mine, he was not a racist nor a homophobe and was always clashing heads with his brother because of that. So let's speed things up. We become a couple when I'm 17 and he's 20. Things are incredible and our relationship is good. He's not my first relationship as I'd gotten over that no dating thing and dated other guys during our period of friendship. I literally have no complaints about him as a boyfriend. The problem was Patrick. Yes. That man had no problem with me when I was just David's friend, but as soon as I became the girlfriend, Patrick started treating me and David horribly. If we were together, Patrick would call and ask David if he was spending time with his little whore, which made David tell Patrick to fuck off and hang up the phone and spend the night with me. He'd apologize, and I'd say it wasn't his fault as it really wasn't. He'd stood up for me more times than I could remember. I never let Patrick's comments bother me, and I'd usually flat out ignore him whenever I saw him. He was an asshole and didn't deserve my attention. So Patrick became insanely jealous. He thought he was losing his little brother and it was all very stressful, and it only came to a stop and got a bit better when David told Patrick to either cut that shit out or he'd cut him off from his life forever. He told Patrick that if he ever so much made a nasty comment about me, even if behind his back, he'd go on pretending he didn't have a brother. That shook him up a little and the comments stopped, although he'd still call when we got together or roll his eyes whenever he was in our presence and saw us being cute or whatever. I know how much the situation hurt David, because even though he was aware of how nasty and simple-minded his brother could be, it was still his brother and he loved him. I was blessed with loving parents, but I understood David. There were times when he'd break down and cry because his brother had gotten into trouble again and I'd just feel mad and heartbroken. Sadly, I didn't really know then what I know now about abuse/manipulation. For instance, I know Patrick really did love David, and he knew David loved him, but he was deathly scared of someone else, me, taking his brother away from him, so he'd try to manipulate David with sentences like, "You know, when this bitch leaves you, you'll only have me in this whole world." Lovely, isn't it? The years passed, I was still very much in love with David and David with me. I was 22 and David 25. I was considering studying abroad, in France. It wasn't set in stone, and while it all sounded very dreamy and marvelous, a big part of me didn't really want to go. It's just that my parents were so proud of me and about the opportunity, and they've always been amazing to me. I didn't want to let them down. So by this time I was still living with my parents, but David was renting an apartment and living with a roommate, and his brother would visit every now and then. I could see that he still hated me, but given that David and I had been dating for such a long time, I guess he just accepted me into his little brother's life. Patrick hadn't changed with age and was still unpleasant, but a bit more behaved. When I told David the news one night, he was visibly shaken. I said I didn't know what I'd do yet, and we tried to carry on with our date, but the mood was ruined and we had a fight. He said he understood my side, but that it wasn't like I'd be a few hours away, I'd be in France. I told him that a lot of couples make things like this work. For the record, I was talking out of my ass, and I tried to convince him that it wouldn't be that bad. It didn't work, but once things cooled off, we just agreed to talk about it when I knew what I wanted to do. The thing is, while this France thing started more as a way to make my parents proud, as the days went by I started liking the idea. Really liking it. I'd be studying literature and journalism in France. I could write a novel about how I was feeling torn and how I went back and forth on the issue, and I'd end up choosing David every time. But I guess I let this small worry in. What if I'm really throwing a great opportunity away? What if I didn't take it and stayed, and then, years down the road, resented David? Resenting him and blaming him scared me way more than leaving for a while and then coming back to him. I'd made my decision, and when I invited him over, I didn't even need to tell him because I was already crying. We had a huge fight, and he begged me not to go. He said he supported me and whatever I wanted to do with my education, but that I didn't have to go so far away. He cried, shouted, begged, and I did the same. I'd be leaving in 2 months, and I asked him to stop fighting. We could be LDR and I wouldn't be gone forever, I'd come back to him. He was mad and wasn't listening to me. He wanted to go home, but I begged him not to because he was angry and I didn't want him driving angry. I'm paranoid about this sort of thing. Fighting with someone I love and then never seeing them again is one of my biggest fears. He knows about this fear of mine, and he stayed. He went to living room, while I stayed in my bedroom. When it was close to midnight, I went to fetch him from there, because I didn't want to fight. I found him watching a TV show on the couch, and he was still angry. I asked him to come to bed with me and grabbed his hand, and he looked at me for a moment before letting me pull him up. We spent the night together, and in the morning he told me he couldn't do this, couldn't be with me knowing I'd be leaving him. He said it was best if we just stopped seeing each other now. I started crying immediately, but I didn't ask him to reconsider. I wanted to, but if after spending the night together after that big fight, he still thought it was best to stay apart, then there was no way I could convince him otherwise. He kissed me, said he loved me, and wished me luck, and I was a freaking mess. I'll skip the part where I spend the next few weeks going back and forth again on my decision, and wondering if I made the right choice. It was torture. I wanted to call him all the time and beg for him to come back, but I refrained myself, even went as far to give my mom my phone so she could hide it from me. I only broke down once and called him. I wanted to text him, but the thought of him seeing the text and not replying scared me. Because that would be horrible and give me no hope for a second chance, but he didn't pick up. Life went on and I was miserable, but I cling to France more than ever. I guess this is the part one surprise you guys. On the 2nd month after our breakup, I found out I was pregnant. I don't know how important the detail of birth control is here, but it was a mistake on both of our parts where we didn't use a condom on 2 instances. I wasn't on the pill back then, I am now. Anyway, I panicked. The trip was 2 weeks away, and I didn't even care about it anymore. I wanted to get to David and tell him I was sorry and tell him about the pregnancy and that we could be a family and whatnot. Except, no matter how many times I called, he wouldn't pick up. I texted him and he never even saw the messages. I went to his apartment only to find out by his roommate that David had gone on a road trip with Patrick. I freaked out, and scared the crap of his roommate and asked if he knew where, road trip to where, but he, roommate, didn't know. They weren't close friends, and the only thing David said was that he'd be out on a trip with Patrick and that's it. I sent even more texts, but he'd never see them. I tried to track him down, to no avail. Finally, I decided to write him an email. In my mind, he wasn't seeing the texts because he was on the road, but he was bound to stop at some place sometime, right? So he'd see the email and then he'd know, and come back. I wrote the damn thing and told him everything. I asked him please to call me as soon as he read it because I need to talk to him, to talk about our baby. I needed him. This was on the course of a week. The next week was my trip to France. I kept hoping he'd call, write back or whatever, but he never did. I was devastated. I couldn't believe the man I loved for such a long time, the man I thought was good, could just ignore me like that. I kept trying to call him, but it'd ring and I'd get voicemail. Then all I'd get was a notification saying that number couldn't be reached. To say my heart was broken doesn't make any justice to how I truly felt. I considered waiting until he came back, but if he was ignoring me like this when I'd just told him I was pregnant, then there was no point in waiting. In my mind, he hated me and never wanted to see me again. In my mind, he was ignoring/refusing our unborn child. It was the hardest thing I ever had to do, but I was keeping the baby and I didn't have the luxury to keep lying in bed, hoping he'd come back. I took that opportunity and traveled to France. I talked to everyone in charge about my pregnancy. They said there was no problem, and so I studied, had a healthy, beautiful baby girl whom I adore very much, and spent the next 4 years focusing on my life and my child. I essentially disappeared for everyone else back in my hometown except my parents. I changed phones, and I was never into having Facebook or Instagram, so I never bothered with it. I did lose contact with some good friends, but if I'm being honest, I didn't mind it that much. Everything and everyone reminded me of my old life, and my old life reminded me of David. Anyway, I came back to my hometown for the first time in 4 years 8 months ago. My parents offered to let me stay with them again, but I rented a nice little house next to the school I'm currently teaching in. It's just me and my baby girl, and things are fine. Well, we're fine. I knew I'd run into him. You can find anyone on this damn town as it's so small. There was the chance that maybe he'd have moved, but I knew it was a slim one because he really loves this place. It's his home. So I ran into him while I was stuck in traffic. I didn't have my daughter with me and was coming back from work. I saw him on the sidewalk and he saw me. Bear in mind we had had no contact for 4 years. We stared at each other until the light turned green and he called out my name, but I didn't stop. I couldn't forgive him. This is way too long already, so I'll skip over and say that over the course of a few, emotionally draining weeks, he found me and kept trying to reach me until I finally gave in and snapped at him. My parents were really against it, of course, but I did want to get some closure or whatever. I just wanted to know how he could be so fucking horrible to me. My daughter stayed with my parents, and she was more than thrilled, considering they dawed on her like crazy. I left to meet David. This is where when things get crazy. And I mean crazy. He tries to make small talk, but I'm having none of it, and I jump to the texts and email. I ask how he could do that to me, how he had no remorse for ignoring me when I was pregnant with our child, how he could throw everything we had in the trash just because I wanted to study abroad. He went crazy. But not crazy in a bad, hurt me way. His eyes were wide and he was shaking and saying he had never read any email, that he didn't know about the pregnancy. He kept asking if I was telling him the truth, wanting to know if I kept our baby. I wasn't having it, and I asked him to tell me how in the world couldn't he have seen the email or the texts. He told me that as soon as we broke up, when he left that morning, he told his brother. I can only imagine what his brother said about me, but anyway, his brother came up with the road trip and forbade him to bring his phone as this was going to be a brother's trip and Patrick would help David get over me. When they came back, Patrick erased my texts from his phone for him. This is believable because the texts I sent never revealed the pregnancy, only the email did. So he could have easily thought I just wanted to apologize or get back together and was being crazy about it. When I asked about the email, he said when he came back and logged on his computer and checked his email, there was none from me. I didn't believe him, but he kept begging me to, kept saying I knew him, he hadn't changed, that me leaving was the worst thing that ever happened to him, that he would never abandon me and our baby. He wanted to see her. He kept saying he was sorry over and over and over again. I still left, but something felt off and my heart was heavy. He sounded sincere. If he was ashamed of what he did, why not say it? Why come up with some elaborate lie about how he didn't have his phone with him? He could have easily told me he freaked out. But the thing is that when I told him about the email and the pregnancy, he looked surprised/shocked. The way he kept asking me if I was telling the truth, I don't know. Part of me believed him or wanted to believe him. But then another part just wanted me to tell him to fuck off, because if he was being honest, then it'd mean that I spent 4 years thinking the father of my child abandoned us when that wasn't the case at all. I told my parents and even them seemed surprised, but advised me to be careful, told me that it is more than probably a lie and he just wants to save his face. I let things go and spent the night with my daughter, and a few days later, he asked me to meet him again. He kept saying it urgent and that if after that I never wanted to see him again then fine, but that I needed to hear him out. Call me weak, but I agreed. When I arrived, he was fumming. He was shaking, he was mad. The last time I saw him like that was when we broke up. He was never violent, but I felt weird seeing him like that. I asked him what was so important and he told me that it was his brother. That's it. I asked him to explain, and here's the reason why you guys needed to know this huge backstory first, why you guys needed to know about his relationship with his brother. Patrick knew his passwords. Patrick knew everything. Patrick had logged in David's email account and deleted the one I sent. I was in shock. I sat there next to him without talking for a few minutes until I asked him how he was sure. How could I trust him? David said he had gone home and contacted his brother. He was desperate after finding out about our daughter, about the texts and the email. Patrick tried to accuse me of lying about the baby, saying it was probably someone else's. He tried to make it seem like I was just trying to make David feel bad. They argued and David hung up. I don't know if remorse kicked in, but Patrick called him back an hour later and told him he had logged in and deleted the email because he was afraid David would come back to me and forget about him. He claims to not have read the email, that he didn't know about the pregnancy either, but I'm sure that's a lie. David told me all of this while apologizing and crying and begging me to believe him. I was shocked, stunned, frozen. If it's true, all that suffering happened because of Patrick. David kept begging me to forgive him, saying he had cut off relations to his brother and that it took every ounce of willpower not to go to his house and kill him. He told me he would have never abandoned me. He said he understood my anger, but if I could find it in my heart to let him see our baby girl. Even if just once. He begged me to believe him until his voice started to crack. I told him I needed time to think. It's been 4 days since that event. 4. My parents are schoked, I can't stop crying, I can't think straight. For the love of God, I need some advice. Call me stupid, but a huge part of me believes him. Patrick is a piece of shit and capable of doing that. He was always scared of losing his brother because David is the only person in the world who could love him, even with all his mistakes. Another part thinks I'm being dumb. David has been giving me space and has messaged me only once, telling me he's willing to accept whatever I decide. I don't know what to do. I need to think about my daughter. If it's true, then I don't want my baby to grow up without her dad. If he's willing to be a father, I don't know. I don't know. Help, please.